have to say, actually, it's quite hard to follow Vice President Al Gore. He set quite a standard, and actually, what was really remarkable was how he understood the spirit and the significance of this conference. It is true that he came specially for it because he promised he would, but I think he has understood, as we have, just how significant it is. But what he added in his own way, and we need to take that on board, and I think we do, is that sense of urgency, the sense that we have to see more action in the right places by the right people with responsibility, and that has to happen. As he said, we have to connect the dots. I'd like to just take a moment to recognize that this was a different conference because we planned it to be different. We really did. We took the time to plan it, and that took a lot of people. And I don't have the time and the space allotted to me to thank all the people, but just look around at all the red badges. Then you'll know the red, what do you call them, Langars or whatever. And they're the ones, and they're out in the hall, and they're upstairs, and they're around the room, and they're everywhere. And the only other person I want you to put your hands together and thank individually, because she's been with us so effectively, is Anya Lawler, our Master of Ceremonies. Anya, come on, stand up, take a bow. And now I have an almost impossible task. I know that I won't be able to capture all that was discussed in the last 2 days, but rest assured that any of the good ideas that I miss here have been collected by the rapporteurs so that we will capture and include them in the conference report. But I personally, as I think you can see, I'm so energized and so lifted and so inspired by what I heard. And I'm honored to try to reflect some of our collective thinking. And I hope you hear some of your voices and some of the thoughts that you've contributed. The first message I take from this conference is that we need to do more of this. Getting grassroots practitioners, the people with experience and who live with the problems we're trying to solve, together with the policymakers with responsibility at national and indeed at international level. We need to have more meetings like this, not just in Ireland, but all over the world. So I want to ask, who's going to be next? Don't put up your hand or think about it. Who can commit to ensuring that grassroots practitioners will be included in the next meeting or conference they hold? And let's take policymakers themselves into communities. That was one of the ideas that we heard. And other grassroots practitioners to new places and cultures to facilitate the direct sharing of experience. It's been wonderful to see the sharing here in Dublin. I think some of us assume that everybody knows what the 2015 development agenda is. But it's clear from this conference that despite a lot of expertise, that we have work to do to raise awareness of the different processes that are in train for post-2016. I know that in the Red Learning Circle this morning, this was expressed as, we need to kick it out of the elite. We need to kick it out of the elite and put it into mainstream, real discussions of people, because we need language that communicates to people. And we need to communicate in two directions and spread the word that there is an opportunity to move away from business as usual and to capture real solutions and inject these into the discussions. We can't waste the opportunity that we have between now and 2015. Those who are going to be making the decisions need to be aware of the realities we've been discussing, the realities on the ground. And we all have to be champions, super champions of this cause, as Lindaway reminded us. All of us, super champions. So this meeting, I think it's fair to say, is a kind of microcosm of what needs to happen between now and 2015. New relationships have been ignited here. People have met, talked, and listened to each other, and that wouldn't be people that would normally meet each other. I get a real sense that the learning has been influential learning, influential to those of us who've been here and listened. Influential learning by policymakers listening to real experiences, and by grassroots practitioners sharing stories, ideas, and solutions. I'm pleased that these encounters have been respectful, meaningful, and hopefully the start of something new. If we all do something different as a result of what we've learned here, that itself is an outcome. who will you stay in contact with when you leave Dublin? Who will you go and visit? Who will you invite to your next event? What will you do differently? Esther from Malawi said, and I loved the way she said it, she said, you have to listen to me because I have experience. What I know isn't written in your papers. And there are a lot of people here with the experience that isn't written in the papers. We have examples from Ethiopia, from Malawi, from Senegal and elsewhere of how local knowledge has to be the foundation on which research and solutions are built. We heard in Lesotho about homegrown ideas that are simple and practical, which have been scaled up to national level. This makes the case for putting people at the centre because they know what they need and what they want. Paulus Verschuren said to me at lunchtime when we were going round the learning circles to glean the best ideas, he said, local people don't have to think outside the box because they don't put things in boxes in the first place. And I think that's a very good way of putting it. Now, if we could reflect this in the post-2015 agenda, that would be progress. Several learning circles highlighted the need to strengthen institutions and set up platforms for real dialogue between all stakeholders to enable local priorities and solutions to be communicated and to be scaled up. Equally, when researchers and policymakers really want to catalyse change, they need to find better ways to express themselves in clear, plain language, and to use various ways of communicating, from the high-tech to the culturally appropriate. So, and I'm delighted to be able to say this, Facebook in the Arctic, as we heard, drama in Niger, and radio and TV in Nepal. Likewise, laws, policies, and international frameworks aren't enough. This was said over and over again, particularly in the rights learning circle. They need to be translated into action, they need to be meaningful, and there need to be resources and awareness raising. Gender penetrated largely, and on gender we heard the simple idea that is so important. Don't keep half the people outside the door. And if we haven't learned that, I think we need to really examine ourselves. But we had so many champions, super champions. We had Aishatu, Cecilia, Runa, Bayarama, Aizatu, Esther, Etrida, Dulce, Lesse, Patricia, many more, but they were the ones that I particularly heard, and others. And you showed us, by your stories, by your case stories, what women can achieve when given half the opportunity. And we need to be careful that we aren't adding to women's workload. That was a very thoughtful idea that came out, or assuming that women will benefit necessarily from interventions. I think this was expressed well in the context of Lesotho as, will my kids eat more veggies if I grow them, or will my husband sell them so that he can buy a saddle for his horse? So I think you all know that sometimes interventions may not have the intended consequences, and we have to be very careful. Something I know a lot of you are waiting to hear, and that came through loud and clear, and we talked about it at the reception last night. We need to get the resources needed to deliver change at the local level. And suggestions include directing resources to districts, to communities, and to farmer and herder organisations, not just to ministries at national level. The money has to go directly, because all too often it doesn't filter down. It's not known about, and it doesn't get to those who need it. From our esteemed president's very inspirational opening onwards, we were reminded not to dodge the politics and the difficult issues, including the social and cultural constraints that stop us from making progress when other barriers are removed. We have to tackle issues around land ownership, power struggles, inequalities, the rule of law, and the need to uphold human rights. We can't be afraid of empowering people or protecting rights. It's not a zero-sum game. I think Nora Owen kind of tried to get us to say, don't be afraid of it, and she's right. Giving power to another will not make you powerless. It might instead lead to very positive change. I want to speak to the private sector, and we admit that we needed to have more private sector here. But I say to the private sector, and we'll do so again tomorrow morning in a separate meeting, speak up, engage. We need to hear your voice. We know you have a role to play. In fact, the case study on scaling up access to legumes in Malawi showed that the private sector, business, has to be brought on board at an early stage to enable scaling up and commercialisation. We heard the view expressed that it would have helped so much if this had been done earlier. And I think many of you will know that experience, that if you're going to learn about marketing, promote your products. The Learning Circle on Rights knew that rights belong to all of us, from people to business and governments. I think it's true that in a very nice way, and in a way that was drawing out friendships and warmth between us, we celebrated diversity here at this conference. And this highlights the need to recognise diversity. Pastoralists, forest people, hunters and gatherers, and slum dwellers all need their way of life to be recognised and respected as a valuable contribution to sustainable development. We've seen the reality, and it came out again and again from the case studies and the personal experiences. We've seen that poor people simply have to adapt. And Al Gore brought this point out very strongly as well. Of necessity, they have to adapt to climate change because they have no other option. It's undermining their livelihoods. They have to adapt. But in the industrialized world, we have to somehow find a similar compulsion to change our consumption and production patterns and to take action on climate change. We don't somehow have the same driving need of necessity. How are we going to create that? How are we going to make sure that we feel the same compulsion to make the changes we need to make in consumption and production habits and get that urgency? It's an injustice to put the burden of dealing with climate change on the local people who are affected. The developed countries have to take a lead on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is a basic tenet of climate justice, enshrined indeed in the Climate Change Convention. And while we reduce emissions, we must also deliver on commitments to provide financing for adaptation and to make it flow to the local level. It's simply too hard to get at the money that is there and not enough money in the pot. The message from the people here to global decision makers is, put your money where your mouth is. There needs to be more of that resourcing. Deliver the commitments you've made. All the good work showcased in the last 2 days will be in effect washed away unless we take action on climate change. We also have to stop making contradictions. You can't invest in adaptation to change climate change and fossil fuels at the same time. We heard indeed from Minister Coveney, Minister of Agriculture of Ireland, of the need for more coherence between policies on agriculture, climate change and development in the European Union. This morning, the Orange Learning Circle suggested that local people have to influence Ireland and that Ireland has to influence the European Union, which in turn has to put a new agenda forward for the post-2015 informed by this dynamic. I believe that the Taoiseach sitting here and Minister Joe Costello have heard that message and heard it very well. Of course, the MDGs matter, the post-2015 agenda matters, the Sustainable Development Goals matter, but so too does the climate change regime, as Vice President Al Gore emphasised. We have to stop looking at these as separate territories run by separate people with separate mandates. So to the climate change negotiators here, are you going to bring food and nutrition securities issues into the Climate Convention as an argument and a compelling one for urgent action? Will you bring the voices we heard here to the table? To the development practitioners here, will you integrate climate change into your work and be advocates for climate justice? We simply have to bring those two agendas, both of whom have a key date in 2015, more together to link with each other and inform each other and indeed resource each other. The new international agenda will only be effective if it's supported by national and subnational commitments and targets with practical implementation plans. Other advice is to connect this new post-2015 agenda to the MDGs and not to start again. Finally, I think we can conclude that we have shown what it means when we talk about a people-centred approach, and that a people-centred approach can be effective. We need to bring more farmers, pastoralists, fisherfolk and women to the table to negotiate the post-2015 agenda. This conference has shown that it can be done and that given the opportunity, they are articulate and convincing and experts. They know the problems and they know the solutions. Jay reminded us earlier, in the words of Nelson Mandela, that overcoming poverty is not a task of charity, it is an act of justice. We've shown and have continued to argue that tackling hunger, undernutrition and climate justice are also issues of justice and that they are critical to the post-2015 agenda. These are the messages that we will take forward on your behalf. you're about to hear our commitments. And I ask you very sincerely, keep an eye on us. We want to be held accountable. Thank you very much.